I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with section 14.4 from Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. We're picking up here. For all that, though, I was in no sense a military man myself. The Army is a profession that requires a great deal of technique. As I saw and noted well for myself, it demands more than any other profession a long period of careful training. In order not to lose the techniques once they are acquired, constant and unrelaxing practice is necessary, much as a pianist would practice every day in order to not lose the delicacy of his touch. Nothing gives the armed forces so much attraction as the fact that even the most trivial duty is ultimately an emanation of something far loftier and more glorious, and is linked somewhere with the idea of death. The man of letters, on the other hand, must scratch together his own glory from the rubbish within himself, already overfamiliar in every detail, and refurbish it for the public eye. Two different voices constantly call to us. One comes from within, the other from without. The one from without is one's daily duty. If the part of the mind that responded to duty corresponded exactly with the voice from within, then one would indeed be supremely happy. On a May afternoon of unseasonably cold drizzle, I was alone in the dormitory, the firing practice that I had been due to witness having been cancelled on account of the rain. It was chilly there on the plain skirting the foot of Mount Fuji, more like a winter's day than early summer. On such a day, tall city buildings where men worked would be aglow with lights even in the daytime. And the women at home would be knitting by artificial light, or watching the television, perhaps repenting having put the gas fires away too soon. Ordinary bourgeois life held no force sufficiently compelling to drag one out into the chill drizzle without so much as an umbrella. Unexpectedly, a non-commissioned officer arrived in a jeep to fetch me. The firing practice, he explained, was going ahead despite the rain. The jeep drove steadily along the potholed road across the plain, lurching violently as it went. Not a soul was in sight of the plain. The jeep climbed a slope down which the rain washed in sheets, and drove down the other side again. Visibility was restricted. The wind gathered strength, and the clumps of grass bowed down before it. From a gap in the hood, the cold rain beat mercilessly on my cheeks. I was glad that they had come from the plain to fetch me on such a day. It was an emergency duty, a voice summoned me lustily from afar. The feeling of hastily leaving a warm lair in response to a voice calling from across the vast rain-blurred plain had a primitive appeal that I had not savored for many a day. On such occasions, something unknown compels me, almost tears me away from the warm fireside. There's no reluctance or hesitation. I gladly go to meet the messenger from the ends of the earth. In most cases, he has some connection with death or pleasure or instinct, and in the instant of my departure I abandon everything that is comfortable and familiar. I felt, savored just such a moment long ago in the distant past. In the past, though, the voice that had called me from without had not corresponded precisely to the voice from within. This, I believe, is because I was unable to meet the call from without with my body, managing barely to do so with words instead. I was familiar, it is true, with the sweet pain that occurred when it became entangled in the complex mesh of ideas, but I was ignorant as yet of the deep-rooted joy produced when the two types of summons meeting in my body find themselves perfectly matched. Before long there came the high-pitched whine of the guns, and I caught sight of the bright orange tracer shells being fired with repeated corrections for error at targets half obscured by the drifting rain. The next hour I spent sitting in the mire with the rain beating down on me. I recall another memory. I was running alone on December 14th on the main track of the National Stadium beneath the first glimmerings of dawn. In reality, this kind of behavior was no more than a fictional task, a piece of drunken excess, one might call it. Yet I have never felt so keenly that I was enjoying the ultimate in extravagance, nor have I ever felt so sure that the daybreak belonged to me alone. It was a freezing dawn. The National Stadium was a great lily, of which the vast arena, utterly deserted, formed the overblown speckled grayish-white petals. I wore only a running shirt and pants. The morning breeze struck chill to the bone. My hands were soon numb. As I passed the gloom in front of the stands on the east side, the cold was daunting. The west side, on which the first rays of the sun were already striking, was more bearable. I had circled the 400-meter track 4 times and was on my 5th time around. The sun, peering over the top of the stands, was still intercepted by the edge of the lily's petals, and the magenta of a reluctant dawn still lingered in the sky. The east side of the stadium was touched by the last of the cold night breeze. As I ran, I breathed not only the knife-sharp air, but the lingering aroma of the dawn. The tumult, the cries of joy from the stands, the smell of athletes' lotion heightened by the morning chill, the pounding of red hearts, the fierce resolve of such was compounded the fragrance of the great lily, a fragrance that the stadium had retained all through the night. And the brick red of the track was unmistakably the color of the lily's pollen. As I ran, my mind was filled with one idea: the relationship between the voluptuous lily of dawn and the purity of the body. So completely did this difficult metaphysical problem engross me that I went on running, oblivious to fatigue. It was a problem that somewhere deep down related to myself. It linked up with my boyhood hypocrisy concerning the purity and sanctity of the body, and had in bearing, I suspected, on the distant martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. The reader is asked to notice that I say nothing of my own everyday life. My intention is to talk only of the several mysteries to which I have been party. Running, too, was a mystery. It immediately placed a non-routine burden on the heart, washing away the emotions of the daily round. Before long, my blood would not permit a halt of even a day or two. Something ceasingly set me to work. My body could no longer tolerate indolence, but began instantly to thirst for violent action, forever urging me on. Thus for many a day I led a life that others might well dismiss as frenzied obsession. From the gymnasium to the fencing school, from the school to the gymnasium, my solace lay more than anywhere, indeed lay solely, in the small rebirths that occurred immediately after exercise. Ceaseless motion, ceaseless violent deaths, ceaseless escape from cold objectivity. By now I could no longer live without such mysteries. And needless to say, within each mystery there lay a small imitation of death. All unawares, I had embarked on a kind of pitiless round. My age pursued me, murmuring behind my back, "How long will it last?" Yet so firmly was I in the clutches of my healthy vice that to go back to the world of words without the mystery of these rebirths was no longer possible. This does not imply, of course, that after a small rebirth of the soul in my flesh I went back reluctantly with a sense of duty to the world of words. On the contrary, this was the one procedure that ensured that I should return to them joyfully and with a glad heart. The demands I made on words became still more strict and exacting. I shunned the latest styles like the plague. Perhaps I was gradually seeking to rediscover the unsullied fortress of words that I had known during the war. It may be that I was trying to reconstruct everything according to the pattern that I had learned before, to find once more my fortress of words, that paradoxical base of freedom outside which I was forever threatened, yet inside which I enjoyed an unparalleled freedom. It was also an attempt to recapture the intoxication I experienced, free from guilt about words, at the age when I asked words to fulfill only the purest of functions. And that meant trying to recover my own self as it had been when eaten away by the white ants of words, and to reinforce it like a sturdy body. It was an attempt to restore a state of affairs in which words, however far they might be from the truth, were for me the only source of real happiness and freedom, much as a child will put a backing of thick, strong paper on a backgammon board that long use has severed at the folds. It meant, in a sense, a return to the poem without pain, a return to my private golden age. Was I ignorant then when I was 17? I think not. I knew everything. A quarter century's experience of life since then has added nothing to what I knew. The only difference is that at 17 I had no, quote, realism. How wonderful it would be, I felt, if I could only go back to that omniscience in which I bathed as agreeably as in cold water in summer. Examining myself in detail as I was at that age, I found that the parts of me that my words had without doubt ended were extremely few, and that the areas polluted by the radiation of omniscience were very restricted. The reason was that, though I wanted to use words as a memorial, as my bequest to posterity, I had got the method wrong. I was cutting down on, even rejecting omniscience, and entrusting to words the whole of my rebellion against the age. I was preoccupied with the task of making words reflect my body, even though I had none, and of sending them winging off towards the future or towards death, bearing my longings like a carrier pigeon bearing a message in the silver tube attached to its small red leg. Even though one might be justified in describing this process as one designed not to let words come to an end, there was, nevertheless, a kind of intoxication in it. Earlier, I defined the essential function of words as a kind of magic in which the long void spent waiting for the absolute is progressively consumed by writing, much as embroidery slowly covers the pure white of a long sash. At the same time, I pointed out that spirit, which chopped into lengths by words has its natural sense of the continuity of life constantly disrupted, is unable to distinguish a true end, and thus never knows an end at all. If that is so, what function do words have for the spirit when it finally does become aware of the end? An admirable example in miniature of what happens in such a case is to be found in the collection of letters written by young men of the Suicide Squad before setting off on their last mission, that is preserved today at the formal naval base of Iwo. Visiting the museum one late summer's day, I was struck by the remarkable contrast between the majority of letters, which were written in an impressive, orderly style, and the occasional letter rapidly dashed off in pencil. As I stood there before the glass cases reading the last testaments of these young heroes, I felt suddenly that I had resolved the question that had long worried me. At such times, did men use words to tell the truth, or did they try to make of them some memorial? One letter that still remains very vivid in my mind was written in pencil on a piece of rice paper in a youthful, almost careless scribble. If my memory is not mistaken, it was to the following effect and broke off abruptly in just this fashion. Quote, "At the moment I am full of life, my whole body overflowing with youth and strength. It seems impossible that I shall be dead in 3 hours' time, and yet." End quote. When someone seeks to tell the truth, words always falter in this way. I can almost see him now fumbling for words, not from shyness nor from fear, for the naked truth inevitably produces this verbal stumbling, but rather as a sign of certain rough quality about truth itself. The young man in question had no long drawn-out void left in which to await the absolute, nor did we have time to wind things up with words in a leisurely way. As he hurtled towards death, his final, everyday phrases seized on a moment when the feeling for life, like chloroform in the strange headiness it produces, had temporarily benumbed his spirit's awareness of the end, and like a well-loved dog leaping up at its master, came rushing out upon him only to be dashed rudely aside. The neater letters, on the other hand, with their pithy phrases about duty to one's fatherland, destroying the enemy, eternal right, and the identity of life and death, obviously selected what were considered to be the most impressive, the most noble from among a large number of ready-made concepts, and clearly revealed a determination, by eliminating anything in the way of personal psychology, to identify the self with the splendid words chosen. The slogan-like phrases thus written were, of course, in every sense, quote, words, but ready-made though they might have been, they were special words, set at a height loftier than any commonplace action can ever attain. Once there were such words, though they are lost to us nowadays. They were not simply beautiful phrases, but a constant summons to superhuman behavior, words that demanded that the individual stake his very life on an attempt to climb to their own lofty heights. Words such as these, in which something first uttered as a conscious resolve gradually comes to demand an inescapable identification, lacked from the outset any bridge that might link them with ordinary, everyday preoccupations. More than other words, and despite the ambiguity of their sense and content, they were filled with a glory not of this world. They were impersonality and monumentality, demanded the strict elimination of individuality, and spurned the construction of monuments based on personal action. If the concept of the hero is a physical one, then just as Alexander the Great acquired heroic stature by modeling himself on Achilles, the conditions necessary for becoming a hero must be both a ban on originality and a true faithfulness to the classical model. Unlike the words of a genius, the words of a hero must be selected as the most impressive and noble from among ready-made concepts. And at the same time, they, more than any words, constitute a splendid language of the flesh. In this way, then, I discovered in that museum the two brave types of words used when the spirit has perceived its end. Compared with these two, the works of my boyhood failed to get to grips with the certainty of death. With ample time to be poisoned by timidity, they were subject in equal measure to the assaults of art. I used words as a totally different way from those beautiful last testaments of the suicide corps. Nevertheless, it seems certain that my spirit, for all the freedom, license even, it permitted to words, and for all the prodigality it permitted the youthful author in his use of them, was still somewhere aware of the end. If one retreads those works now, the signs are plain for all to see. Nowadays, I find myself speculating. The kind of life in which words first appear, followed by the body already corroded by words, was surely not confined to myself alone. I was surely somewhere guilty of a contradiction in rejecting my own uniqueness while affirming the uniqueness of my life as such. The unconscious education of my body should have made the contradiction quite plain to me. At that period, then, the end that the body foresaw and the spirit perceived must have been present in the suicide corps and myself in equal measure. I ought to have been able, even without the body, to take up a stand at some point that left no doubt as to that identity. And among the young men who died, even indeed among the suicide corps, there were beyond doubt some of who were eaten away by the white ants in the same way as myself. Those who died, however, were fortunately secure with a fixed identity, an identity established beyond all doubt, the tragic identity. My omniscience at 17 could hardly have been unaware of this. However, what I had begun was the attempt to remove myself as far as possible from omniscience, determined not to use even one of the materials of which my age was built. The age was built. I mistook obstinate persistence in my own views for purity. What was worse, I mistook my method, too, and sought to leave behind a personal monument. How, though, could something personal ever become a monument? The basic reaction for this illusion is only too clear to me today. At that time I held in contempt a life that could be ended by words. Thus contempt and fear were synonymous in the eyes of the boy that I was then. In all probability, I was afraid of bringing it to an end with words, and yet imagining that imperishability for words lay in escaping as far as possible from reality, I felt an intoxication in this fruitless action. One might say that there was happiness, hope even, in the action. And when the war ended, and the spirit promptly ceased to be aware of the coming end, the intoxication also ceased on the spot. What then could be the real meaning of my attempt, at this late stage, to return to the same point? Was it freedom I was seeking, or the impossible? Or did the two things possibly come to be the same thing? What I was after, obviously, was a revival of the intoxication, and this time, in addition to the intoxication, I was conceited enough to believe that my technique in dealing with words was sufficiently practiced for me to choose impersonal words, thereby enhancing their function as a memorial and putting an end to my life of my own free will. It could be no exaggeration to say, was the only revenge I could take on the spirit for stubbornly refusing to perceive the end. I was loath to take the same course as others who, when the body is turning its steps towards its future decay, refuse to follow it, but silently tag along after the far blinder and more stubborn spirit until they are completely deceived by it. Somehow or other, I must make my spirit conscious once more of the end. Everything started from there. Only there, it was clear, could I find a basis for true freedom. I must soak myself once more in the cold water of my boyhood omniscience. Fresh as a cold bath in summer, the omniscience that the misapplication of words had made me deliberately avoid. But this time I must give expression to everything, including the water itself. That such a return was impossible was obvious without me being told. Yet the impossibility stimulated my mind in its boredom, and the mind, which could no longer be aroused to action save by the impossible, was beginning to have dreams of freedom. I had already seen in the paradox enacted by the body the ultimate form of the freedom that comes through literature, the freedom that comes through words. Be that as it may, that which have eluded me was not death. It was tragedy that I once let slip. More accurately, what had eluded me was the tragedy of the group, or tragedy of a member of the group. If I had achieved identity with the group, participation in tragedy would have been far easier. But from the outset, words had worked to drive me farther and farther from the group. Moreover, feeling as I did that I lacked the physical ability to blend with the group, and that I was therefore constantly rejected by it, I desired somehow to justify myself. It was this desire that led me to polish words so assiduously, with the natural result that the kind of words I dealt in constantly rejected the significance of the group. Or should I say, that the rain of words that fell so steadily within me during the period when my existence was barely adumbrated, like a rain that begins falling before the break of dawn, was in itself a forecast of my inability to adapt to the group. The first thing I did in life was to build up a self amidst that rain. The intuition of my infancy, the intuitive sense that this group represented the principle of the flesh, was correct. To this day I have never once felt the need to amend it. But it was only in later years, when I first came to know that I have called down the dawn of the flesh, that rosy vertigo that descends on one after grueling use of the body and intense fatigue, that I began to perceive the significance of the group. The group was concerned with all those things that could never emerge from words, sweat and tears and cries of joy or pain. If one probed deeper still, it was concerned with the blood that words could never cause to flow. The reason, perhaps, why the testaments of the doomed are oddly remote from individual expression, impressing one rather than their stereotyped quality, is that they are the words of the flesh. At the moment when I first realized that the use of strength and the ensuing fatigue and the sweat and the blood could reveal to my eyes that sacred, ever-swaying blue sky that the shrine bearers gazed on together, and could confer the glorious sense of being the same as others, I already had a foresight, perhaps, of that as-yet distant day when I should step beyond the realm of individuality, into which I had been driven by words and awakened to the meaning of the group. There is, of course, such a thing as the language of the group, but it is in no sense a self-sufficient language. A speech, a slogan, and the words of a play all depend on the physical presence of the public speaker, the campaigner, the actor. Whether it is written down on paper or shouted aloud, the language of the group resolves itself ultimately into physical expression. It is not a language for transmitting private messages from the solitude of one closed room to the solitude of another distant closed room. The group is a concept of uncommunicable shared suffering, a concept that ultimately rejects the agency of words. For shared suffering, more than anything else, is the ultimate opponent of the verbal expression. Not even the mightiest Weltschmerz in the heart of the solitary writer, billowing upwards to the starry heavens like some great circus tent, can create a community of shared suffering, for though the verbal expression may convey pleasure or grief, it cannot convey shared pain. Though pleasure may be readily fired by ideas, only bodies placed under the same circumstances can experience a common suffering. Only through the group I realized through sharing the suffering of the group, could the body reach that height of existence that the individual alone could never attain. And for the body to reach that level at which the divine might be glimpsed, a dissolution of the individuality was necessary. The tragic quality of the group was also necessary. The quality that constantly raised the group out of the abandon and torpor into which it was prone to lapse, leading it to an ever-mounting shared suffering and so to death, which was the ultimate suffering. The group must be open to death, which meant, of course, that it must be a community of warriors. In the dim light of early morning, I was running one of the group, a cotton towel with the symbol of a red sun on the waist in the freezing air. Through the common suffering, the shared cries of encouragement, the shared pace, and the chorus of voices, I felt the slow emergence, like the sweat that gradually beaded on my skin, of that tragic quality that is the affirmation of identity. It was a flame of the flesh, flickering up faintly beneath the biting breeze. The sense of surrendering one's body to a cause gave new life to the muscles. We were united in seeking death and glory. It was not merely my personal quest. The pounding of the heart communicated itself to the group. We shared the same swift pulse. Self-awareness by now was as remote as the distant rumor of the town. I belonged to them, they belonged to me. The two formed an unmistakable us. To belong, what more intense form of existence could there be? Our small circle of oneness was a means to a vision of that vast, dimly gleaming circle of oneness, and all the while foreseeing that narrow happiness, condemned to vanish with the wind, to resolve itself into nothing more than muscles that simply existed. I had a vision where something that, if I were alone, would have resolved back into muscles and words, was held fast by the power of the group and led me away in a far land, where there would be no return. It was perhaps the beginning of my placing of us, by committing himself to this immeasurable power, belonged to the whole. In this way, the group for me had come to represent a bridge that once crossed left no means to return. That's the conclusion of 14.4 of Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Next time we will finish the book in 14.5 by reading the epilogue. I will see you then. Alam.